Some people like it as a chat. Some people like to share by text. Some people email me and tell me what they think of the book, but it's always fun to connect and discuss a book inspired by First Ladies or women in politics. This month, I'm super excited because I've been rereading this book, which I really enjoyed, Hiding in Plain Sight, about Lady Bird Johnson, written by Julia Swig. She did some really interesting research at the Johnson Presidential Library, listening to recordings that Lady Bird made while she was serving as First Lady. And they're really remarkable. And I have learned so much. There's a lot of amazing insight to Lady Bird as a major political power player. So I hope you can join us for that. You can access any of these programs by registering via the National First Ladies Library Eventbrite page. We'll also put some links to our Facebook page to these upcoming programs soon. We are joined this year again for our next legacy lecture by our friend Colleen Christian Burke, who is the Christmas at the White House guru. She worked as a decorator during Laura Bush and I believe the Obama administration a little bit as well. And a volunteer. She has talked to us about decorating the White House and the history of decorating the White House from Jacqueline Kennedy on. And because we have been focusing this year on Nancy Reagan and Jackie Kennedy, she will join us to focus on those two women, both who have played a major role in decorating the White House for Christmas. Jackie, of course, established the themes. Nancy brought her own touch of Hollywood to it. I think both are really interesting comparisons. So I'm very excited about that. It should be really fun. We also have a curator talk about Hillary Clinton and Clinton holiday cards from our collection. So we're going to look at those. We always choose a First Lady to kind of dig deep into holiday-wise. So we're going to talk about Hillary this year. And then our next film, rounding out our Women in Politics little series that we've been doing here, is a documentary about Patsy Mink. So again, another woman who broke barriers in a presidential run, as well as helping to write legislation for Title IX. So I'm very excited about that film. Hopefully you can join us for that one too. You can register on Eventbrite. We usually, if you are tuning in from out of state, what we do is once you register about a week before, if you are out of state, we send through our good friend at Stark Library, Bob Gatos. He sends out a batch of film barcodes for people to connect via online if you're out of state to the film. But you should always check and see if your local library has Canopy or Hoopla, which are the two systems we use to connect with films, because many of them do. It's a great resource. If you're coming to us from Ohio, you can actually go on Stark Library and register for a card. You don't even have to be there. And you can stream a number of really great films, including documentaries that include First Ladies and women who have broken barriers. So we really love collaborating with Stark Library. And last but not least, I want to mention the National Park Service has started their winter hours. And although our original Reagan dresses have left the building and are in the process of making their way back to the Reagan Library, our Nancy Reagan exhibition is still up on view. And we have some amazing artifacts related to Nancy, as well as clothing from the Reagan Ranch that is still up. So that's a really fun exhibition. There are lots of other First Lady artifacts related to First Ladies and their causes. So please stop by. The site is open from Thursday through Saturday, and we are always here doing programs. We have them virtual and we will have some in person in the coming year. So I hope you can join us either way. Without further ado, I want to tell you a little bit about today's program. So we're going to be talking about Geraldine Ferraro's documentary, Paving the Way. If you have questions for our speaker, if you want to tell us what you thought of the film, please type in the chat. You should be able to type in the chat, and you can actually let us know where you are, what you thought of the film, if you remember when Ferraro was running, what your experience of seeing that campaign was. The first thing I'm going to do is show you a preview of the documentary. And again, it's been quite a while since Geraldine Ferraro ran for vice president. So there will be spoilers today, but they're not spoilers that are going to impact your experience of the film. So if you did not get a barcode or a chance to screen it, please reach out to me via email, and I'll post that information in the chat and we will get it to you. So I am going to share my screen again, and hopefully we'll be able to watch the preview together. And then we will introduce our speaker today and get started on our discussion. So here we go.
My mother was very careful to make sure that I was not treated differently from my brother. My mother always felt that the same opportunities that she was affording him, she was going to give to me, even though I was female. Every Halloween, we always had the snazziest costumes. And one year, I said, "Can I be Uncle Sam?" And she didn't say to me, "No, you can't because you're not a boy." She said, "Sure, you can be anything you want to be." I mean, that's what she told me in my life. You can be whatever you want to be. You can do whatever you want to do. All you have to do is work hard.
My fellow citizens, I proudly accept your nomination for Vice President of the United States.
She had an impact. She had an absolute impact. I mean, whether they voted for her or didn't vote for her, she was the most famous face for women in politics, and it inspired others to run.
Are you with us? Then let's go.
What it really encouraged, I think, that may have been more powerful was women to see themselves differently in every sector.
I'm delighted that there is no longer that big sign outside that door that says, "White male only need apply."
She spent her entire adult life both building her own American dream and trying to give it to other people.
It's time to see all the colors of the rainbow when we utter the words, "We, the people of the United States."
It didn't end on election night. Cherie really helped break through the glass ceiling.
What Cherie did was not only to lay the groundwork, but also to lay down a marker that we can't go back.
When they write the history of gender in American politics 100 or 200 years from now, the first woman president will be the most significant figure. The second will be Geraldine Ferraro.
Meet the brand new Subi 3.0.
Okay, so you got a little taste of what the film was about and what it covered. Obviously, there are a number of important political players from across the aisle in the film, as well as some interesting celebrities. If you joined us last month for a discussion of Shirley Chisholm, you might have caught a little glimpse of her in the film. The film was directed by Donna Zaccaro, who was a producer for the Today Show. And Time Out New York said this profile cuts smartly to the inspiring essence of Ferraro's 1984 vice presidential run, a watershed moment for female political representation, swaddled in a no-nonsense queen's toughness. So we are so lucky to be joined today on Election Day by Cherie Strachan, She is professor of political science and director of the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron. Her political science research combines interest in political participation, voluntary civic and political organizations, and political communications. Recent work explores the Me Too movement and women's political ambition, as well as the effects of partisan polarization, rudeness, and civility on political engagement. She also is the co-author of a textbook, Why Don't Women Rule the World, and co-editor of the APSA published resource Strategies for Navigating Graduate School and Beyond, which I probably need to read. I want to welcome Dr. Strachan to the screen, and we'll get her up. Here she is.
Hi. So nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to have you. And again, I know today, or at least tonight and tomorrow, are probably busy days for you answering questions from reporters. So I'm glad you could pause and talk to us today about this film. So I wanted to just open it up for our participants today and say, like, what did you think of the film? And Dr. Strachan, I wanted to ask you, we've been talking a lot about women in politics. We've talked about Shirley Chisholm. We're going to talk about Patsy Mink. What were some of the challenges that Geraldine Ferraro faced when she embarked on a political career?
Yeah, no, I hadn't watched the film before I was invited to participate today, and I really appreciate being invited and, being made aware of the film and, thinking back. One of the things it made me think about is, how little has changed, unfortunately. And so one of the things that stuck out to me about the challenge that Geraldine Ferraro faced, but all of the women who were cutting edge and pushing things forward in the 70s and 80s, but that still affect women today in my own research, is this issue of the double bind. So, women were disenfranchised, women were, seen as helpmates and removed from the public sphere, and all those stereotypes that were used to justify denying women citizenship, used to justify denying women the right to vote, about women being, nurturing, women not, women needing to invest their emotional attention into being submissive, but also caring intensely for children and household. All of those stereotypes still exist. And there's implicit bias, and they're still there. So when women step, and politics was seen as hypermasculine, right? One of the most masculine or sort of aggressive things that you could do, especially in those executive leadership positions. And so women face a double bind because we still have to present, and you see Geraldine Ferraro doing this really successfully, we still have to present as feminine enough to be likable. If you don't present as feminine enough, as warm, welcoming, nurturing, having, I'm running for office because I want to take care of everyone else, not because of my own ambition, being physically attractive in traditionally feminine ways, being appropriate in traditionally feminine ways. If you don't do that, you're disliked, right? There's a knee-jerk reaction to dislike you, which means you're not going to get any support. Like, it's the precursor to everything. But if you come across as too feminine, then you're seen as unqualified, right? So how do you walk this balance? It's this tightrope, this double bind. How do you walk this balance of being perceived as both feminine and masculine at the same time? And we still see this as the major hurdle that female candidates or female politicians have faced that men don't, is that our first task is to be feminine enough to be likable. It's still there.
And she also marketed herself as the tough Democrat, which I thought was really interesting. So she used vocabulary that might have been associated with masculinity, but people also were commenting she had that really typical 80s mom helmet hair that was so cool at the time.
Yeah, and the lipstick and the heels and the dresses and the warm smile and the welcome. I mean, if I don't think she could have gotten away with being tough or calling herself tough without the packaging that made it clear that she was also feminine.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit both about her history and her childhood and how that impacted who she was and who she became, as well as her marriage, because her story is so interesting that she decided to embark on a political career because she started as a teacher, she went on to law school, she became assistant district attorney, but she got married and her husband asked her to stop what she was doing and care for their children. But she also kind of negotiated that she was going to keep her name to pay homage to her mother. So she was kind of walking the tightrope of in her marriage as not only a political candidate, but just a woman in the 1970s and 80s, the way she was dealing with things. And I thought she brought a lot that we didn't see at that time to politics in relation to having been a stay-at-home mom and then being a member of Congress. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, one of the things about her childhood that stuck out to me was that, and we see this in it comes through in research, but it also comes through in biographies of women who do step forward, is they have a different gender socialization from some important figure in their background. Women vote and have since the 1980s at slightly higher rates than men. Every other form of political activity, we come underneath men, right? We're below, particularly things that require persuasion or putting yourself forward as a leader. Women have lower levels of political ambition and being willing to run for office. And when you watch Nancy Pelosi's biography, or you listen to Hillary Clinton talk about the way her parents socialized her, you get the same piece. I wasn't treated any differently than my brothers. I was told I could do anything. So a different gendered socialization, which you then see Ferraro carrying into her marriage, right? Despite the really traditional Catholic background, and despite the certain sort of we're still in the 70s and 80s, we're still sort of carrying that that notion of traditional roles in families forward, and she's carving out a way to do it. And we see Nancy Pelosi doing the same thing. And so you'll see, I don't know that women feel like they have to negotiate that so explicitly or sort of get permission from their husbands anymore, but you do see women running for office later in life. And it's because if women choose to have traditional marriages and families, women still, the research shows, and especially it came forward in the pandemic, women still do the bulk of maintaining the household and especially early childhood care. And so you'll see people running for office when they feel like it's, maybe I can juggle my first job and my second job, my first job at work all day long, and then doing the household, they need a break before they can break free and run for office. So you will see women running for office later after their kids are in school. And really, it was just within the last couple of election cycles that women got permission to spend campaign contribution on childcare. So that's really recent. So now women can actually use donations to pay for childcare so that they can go canvass. That's really recent.
That is really interesting. I did not know that. So Donna in the chat said she loved the film and she would like to know if you think women are overall critiqued more than men running for office.
Yeah, I gotta turn my I've got things that are clicking through here on my email, so I'm just gonna, there we go. Sorry about that. It was making a dinging noise. So yeah, women are still critiqued by that double bind. Women are there's still an implicit bias. There's still research that suggests also women, what you'll see is that women are typically stronger candidates by the time they put themselves forward because they're hyper scrutinized, both in the workplace and when they run for office and enter into those male roles. So, if you know someone who you're encouraging to pursue a promotion at work, for example, they'll make sure every I is dotted, every T is crossed. Oh, and so you see women candidates doing this. I haven't been school board member yet. I have to run for state. I can't just run for governor. I need to check all these boxes first. And so you'll see women by the time they run for office at a higher level, typically being more qualified and more prepared. But that's because we're hyper scrutinized, right? It's the same as when you, any sports fans, if you talk sports with a man you don't know well, and they go, prove it. Are you really, do you really know those stats? Do you really know, are you really good at this? And so you'll see that affecting the way women run for office.
I see that going to record stores too and liking music. They say, do you really know what that band is on your t-shirt? So I can see that happening. I wanted to bring up, we watched a film about Shirley Chisholm last month, and Shirley, when she dealt with members of Congress, she was very straightforward with the white men that she had to deal with, and often pushy, and said, you need to sit down and not talk to me that way. Geraldine Ferraro, when she was in Congress, had a very different approach. And a lot of the feedback from the men in the film was, you know, she was a feminist and she worked with women, but she wasn't rude to us. She had a good reputation with us. So obviously, as a white woman, that was an easier tightrope for her to walk. But can you talk a little bit about that relationship? What the climate was like for women in Congress then, and how she dealt with it?
Yeah, that's I mean, that's all of those things that I just talked about coming together, right? So that the women who are most successful are warm and welcoming first before they, you know, established your femininity and your womanhood first before you push for things. But then also when you have a chance, when there is a seat at the table, or you do have a chance, being over prepared, being so competent, being so efficient or so effective that they can't ignore it, and they start to, those stereotypes start to fade away. But it's also, you know, women have to choose when is it more important for me to establish likability and succeed that way. Well, then you're not, if I tell my students this all the time, if I prioritize likability and acting like a woman to advance my career, or to get invited to do a book chapter, or to do the things that are important to me professionally, I am not tearing down those stereotypes for anyone coming up behind me, right? So you're establishing that other women, to be successful, sort of have to meet those feminine standards first. And so, you know, Geraldine Ferraro perhaps did that and then had a successful career. Sometimes as a tenured full professor, I'm just like, I'm not going to do it, right? I'm going to go in and I'm going to be blunt and I'm going to be straightforward, and I might take a personal hit, but I'm a tenured full professor, so maybe I can choose to do that. And maybe that'll break down some of those stereotypes for people coming behind me. And you see maybe Shirley Chisholm veering on that side, right? Of how do we still have to make these choices. We still have to make these choices.
So in the 1980s, a gender gap developed at the polls that seems to still continue to this day. Can you talk about that gender gap, and how did the parties react to it at the time?
Right. So initially, and the gender gap, the research has showed, didn't happen. It didn't happen. It happened because men left the Democratic Party and became more Republican, starting around Reagan. And women stayed, and the women that had already been aligned with the Democratic Party stayed. So it wasn't women moving, it was men leaving that initially created that gap. And initially you saw, like, for a brief moment in time, the parties trying to address it. You saw both the Republican and the Democratic Party trying to, you know, recruit women into leadership positions, and, you know, sort of trying to mitigate that. And then for a long period, and then the gap keeps getting wider and wider and wider over time. It's just gotten wider over time. And then for a period of time, you saw the two parties, and there's a really good book by Christina Wolbricht, who's at Notre Dame, that the two parties now, part of the polarization that we have is that they've polarized around second wave issues, right? So before there was, right, you see in the film, sort of Olympia Snow and Geraldine Ferraro talking about working together to advance women's issues. And being much more bipartisan than we would sort of anticipate now. And that's because that became a wedge issue between the two parties that's used to differentiate them. And so then for a long period of time, you saw Democrats being more successful at creating leadership opportunities and recruiting women to run for office. And then really just post-Trump, you've seen the Republican Party see and start to catch up again, right? Relaunching those programs to promote women. Really in the Trump and post-Trump era. But the gap's gotten wider. More women now than men continue, and it's just gotten wider to affiliate with and I just saw data, this was in Politico about 2 weeks ago, there was just a recent survey that 44% of 18 to 29-year-old women in the United States currently identify as liberals, which I assume means they're going to vote for Democrats, probably.
So that kind of gendering at the polls is really interesting in the way that this campaign kind of mimics some of the things going on politically today. And I want to jump ahead because we've had a discussion in the chat about some of the issues that Geraldine Ferraro had to deal with. So she joins the ticket as the vice presidential candidate, running along with Fritz Mondale. And there's some mudslinging related to her candidacy. And some of it is around the discussion that we've been having in the chat is around her husband's taxes. Mm-hmm. So another interesting aspect of her life is that she files separately from her husband. And so her husband doesn't share his tax return, which, is something we've been talking about in the political arena lately, as well as the issue of abortion. So Geraldine Ferraro is a Catholic. The issue of abortion becomes really develops as a hot button issue at the time. So I'm wondering if we can, as we're talking about her, if you can talk about some of those controversies and how she approached them and how they've impacted the political landscape today.
Yeah, all of the issues that we were seeing sort of emerge as polarizing issues around this time, and the trends in campaigning have just continued and have been exacerbated. And so it's around this period of time when so there's research called that we started to engage in more politics by other means, which is the mudslinging. So if you feel like you can't win or get traction based on a policy issue, that to go for scandals, to go for personal attributes, or to go toward name calling or demonizing candidates, we really start to see that take off in the late 80s as a viable strategy. And why that is, maybe it's the advertising technology, maybe it's just, we see these really tight races where we swing back and forth like we're seeing today, like, oh, it's a 2% margin, we can't predict who's going to win, so that, maybe candidates and parties are a little more desperate to sway voters with those tactics. But to the extent that those were used against Geraldine Ferraro, they've been exacerbated, those campaign trends up until now, the name calling and all that sort of thing. And then obviously, people, Geraldine Ferraro tried to deal with the abortion issue by saying this is a settled issue. This isn't something I don't have to tell you what I think because the Supreme Court has, sort of superseded. And now obviously we're back to square one with the states, with putting a lot of pressure on our candidates to have to speak to that again. So everything that we saw come through in the film is just a glimpse or a precursor at what we're dealing with full force now.
And interestingly for our institution, because we focus on the lives and the legacies of the first ladies, there is a lot of coalescing around Geraldine Ferraro as a female candidate, a lot of tears and excitement coming from women, but the women in political power who are the helpmates of these candidates really coalesce. And these are two women, Nancy Reagan and Barbara Bush, who do not like each other. And they both really mudsling against Geraldine Ferraro, which I thought was really interesting.
I wonder, I was watching that too, and I wonder if at the time, so I do research on civility, and we've just, and rudeness in politics, and we've just seen, we are in an era of escalating rudeness. Typically what you see with civility, the balance between civility and rudeness in American politics is right before a critical realigning election, like FDR or Abraham Lincoln with the Civil War got pretty bad. You'll see an escalation of rudeness and name calling and nastiness and sort of demonizing the other side. And then after that critical realigning election, it tampers back down. We go back to civility and deliberation, because deliberation with people we disagree with is how we make it work. And we are in an era since Geraldine Ferraro, right? We start to see the escalation of rudeness and nastiness and name calling, and it doesn't go away. But at the time Geraldine Ferraro was running, we hadn't broken a lot of those norms yet, right? We hadn't had candidates, like we still as an electorate, or as, you know, Walter Cronkite would have been like appalled, right, at the name calling or the rudeness, and it would still cost you votes because we hadn't sort of become acclimated to it. I wonder if behind the scenes the campaigns were really leery, and we saw Bush take a drumming for it at the debate. I wonder if the campaign said, we can't have a male candidate, this petite woman who's, in addition to being tough, has also presented herself in many traditional ways. We can't have the men look like they're beating her up. And we, you know, when we saw people were upset with Pete Buttigieg and his treatment of Elizabeth Warren recently, right, in the Democratic primary debates, for feeling like he was too aggressive with a woman. So some of that's still there. I wonder if it was a purposeful decision behind the scenes to say to their wives, this is, you're going to have to do this because otherwise I'll look too tough.
A lot of sense.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, civility wise, it's cool to see in the documentary that both George and Barbara Bush are featured. George shares a letter that he wrote to Geraldine when she was on her deathbed. So I thought that was amazing to see that civility between the two parties and to recognize her historic role.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think the last major candidate we've seen do that was John McCain in a debate, or no, it was at a rally where someone was really name calling Barack Obama. It was, you know, during the campaign at a rally, and John McCain stood up and said, no, those things aren't true. He's a fine man. You know, he's a good politician and a fine man. We just happen to fundamentally disagree with each other, and that's why I'm the better candidate. But I think John McCain is like the last one we've seen sort of stand up and defend publicly the character of someone he was trying to defeat.
So speaking of John McCain, it was a while later, but he was the next presidential candidate to choose a female vice presidential candidate running mate, who was Sarah Palin. And thinking as I watched this documentary, there was a discussion, and Fritz Mondale says, you know, we didn't want to choose a woman just to tokenize her, but then as the documentary is kind of telling the story, they talk about the way that the Mondale campaign handled Geraldine Ferraro and just kind of said, well, here's what you're going to do, go do it. And she was really frustrated. So I wonder if you can talk about those early female vice presidential candidates and the way that they were handled by their presidential running mates.
Yeah, I don't know if that's entirely, I mean, I think a lot of vice presidential candidates who are prominent politicians in their own right are actually really frustrated by the way that they're treated by the campaign. So I don't know if that's entirely gendered. I do think that you do see that this is what women have to do. You know, you see Geraldine Ferraro advocating for herself and saying, no, this is a better way to use my time. Let me set my own schedule. And good female politicians, just like good female women leaders in other places, have to have to learn how to juggle that and advocate for themselves, which I think she did really well.
Can you talk a little bit about women on the debate stage? We've kind of alluded to her debate with George Bush, but how she managed the vice presidential debate and how women have approached debating in these sorts of roles.
Yeah, I mean, the research shows that men are evaluated based on their potential or their promise. So there's an assumption that men will have the potential and capacity for leadership, and then they have to prove you wrong. They have to make mistakes to draw your opinion down. And women, on the other hand, have to check all the boxes and have to prove it, right? They have to prove it again, that they are capable, particularly for a male dominated position like vice president or president. And so, yeah, women have to go into those debates being hyper prepared and hyper competent, and also have to be prepared to, now you see Bush, right? You see George Bush carefully trying, but then kind of slipping into being accused of being patronizing. I think that a lot of that, because of the rise in rudeness and the rise of incivility, is gone. And if they see the ability to try to poke holes in someone because of a stereotype about women's capabilities that exists, I think they'll go for it much more quickly now. So one of the things I teach the civic skills or the political skills when I teach women in politics, I have my students practice a technique called name it, shame it, pivot. And you don't want to stick on fighting with someone about a sexist claim, but you can't let it go, right? So you just say, that wasn't an okay thing to say, or that was problematic, right? I think you said that to me because I'm a woman. Here's the real reason I'm running for office. This is what the conversation should be about. And let me tell you why I'm the best candidate, or let me tell you why I'm the best leader. And here's what I'm going to do. So you don't let them get away with it, but you quickly flip the conversation back to where you want it to be. But if women don't, and it works for sexism, it works for racism, it works for ageism, it works for anything where you feel it's not a justified critique. And sometimes the hits can be so hard that if you're not, that they're shocking, right? That you're not prepared for how to respond. So I tell my young women when we're thinking about preparing them to run for office, this needs to be a muscle memory. You need to just be able to do that and have it roll off your tongue as soon as someone hits you with a new sexist claim.
That's awesome. I wrote that down. Name it, shame it, pivot.
Yep.
So,
practice in the mirror.
definitely will. So Geraldine Ferraro, interestingly enough, also was the first to stand on a riser. And there was that discussion of, it wasn't just something that female candidates did after the fact. It's something that has been adopted by men as well.
Dukakis, I think, negotiated that as well. Yeah. Well, and we still associate, sort of, that's a knee-jerk reaction too, to associate height in men with executive leadership and sort of have implicit bias around those assumptions. So, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about Geraldine Ferraro's legacy and where we are today and how she's impacted that?
Anytime women put themselves forward and are the first, or are able to be the first, or are just able to be more visible and prominent, it changes people's ideas. It changes young girls' ideas. It changes other women's ideas of how they can see themselves, right? How can you envision yourself being president, or how can you envision yourself being vice president if you've never been in a world where you saw that exist, right? Where there was never a woman in that role. And so the more we can put women in those positions, the more it helps people coming up. It changes just the political socialization they get, not necessarily at home, but from the broader political environment. And so how many, we'll never know, right? How many, with all the visibility and all the rallies and then her legacy afterwards, working with Madeleine Albright and in other prominent positions, we will never know how many young girls, even just subliminally, saw that and then thought, well, why shouldn't I do that? Or why can't I do that? And taking all those hits of having to balance that double bind and be willing to be in the limelight and willing to be criticized. Yeah, it's an incredible legacy. And that's one of the reasons why I was so happy to watch the film. The other legacy I think that comes is that until more women are in leadership positions, until more women are in positions where they're the things that they experienced cause struggle. Why did it take so long for it to be allowable for us to spend campaign donations on childcare? Because there weren't enough women complaining about it, right? There weren't enough women in leadership positions complaining about it and say, hey, I can't always pick my kids up at 3:30 if I'm going to this campaign event. Why did it take so long for there to be lactation rooms in our state capitals, right? And in Congress, like the thought that someone might actually have a small child and actually need to take care of it, right? Until Duckworth was there with a baby, we were like, oh yeah, maybe we need to fix that. And so those things too, just the institutional barriers that make it difficult for women to run aren't going to come down until there's enough women in those positions to complain about it. And we are certainly standing on Geraldine Ferraro's shoulders.
And that helps flatten the playing field for male candidates too. I mean,
Absolutely.
they benefit from childcare as well. So I think that, is really interesting, but it takes women, because they bear the brunt of that, to help to push those things through and make those decisions. So we finally have a woman serving as vice president. And I wonder if you can speak about the challenges that she's faced now that she's in office. Kamala Harris, who has definitely benefited from the legacy of Geraldine Ferraro.
Definitely, and is doing in droves what Geraldine Ferraro did. Every time she shows up for a major event, every time she's sent as an ambassador overseas, every time she shows up in the media, we have no idea how widespread that impact is on young girls that just grow up and say, well, there's a vice president. Why can't I be vice president? It just will feel more normal and natural the more we see women in those roles. I do, though, feel that Harris has had to, be careful in how she presents herself. All the double bind is still there. There's also deep criticism of women who, ambitious women are criticized more than ambitious men, right? Or are seen as a threat. And so when women are seeking power or look like they're ambitious, or she looks like she might want to be president, it opens themselves up to more criticism. So I think she's dealing with, at a time of incivility, at a time where the kinds of criticism and complaints, or the kinds of emails privately that people get, that women get, are probably worse now than what Geraldine Ferraro faced, just because we hadn't hit the lows in rudeness and incivility yet.
So last but not least, I want to ask a little bit more about your research, because you've kind of woven through this discussion about female candidates and civility. So thinking ahead to today's midterm election, future presidential candidates, potential women candidates, how do you think things will change for women, especially in relation to civility and walking this kind of tightrope?
So one of the things, one of my recent research projects is I'm really concerned about how the rudeness and incivility affects women, in particular women candidates. I feel like, I can't be as rude or as aggressive as some white male candidates, because women aren't supposed to be angry in public, right? Or, the stereotypes and the language that comes that's directed at women when we act angry in public. People said Barack Obama, for example, was a cool president and never showed emotion, but that's in part because angry Black men or angry Black women are also perceived as scary, right? Or, threatening. So I I've really worried about how that would affect women, but also women from different, right, intersectional identities, women with, women of color. And so we did an experimental design, some colleagues and I, where we, that's right, absolutely. So we did an experimental design where we showed clips of rude political interaction and clips of civil political interactions to students enrolled on college campus on 18 campuses, all the students in political science classes. And they were randomly assigned to one clip or the other. And then we asked them a series of questions about their willingness to be involved in politics and their willingness to, to step forward and run for office. And for nobody likes it, but the people who were willing to say, I'm willing to imitate that behavior in order to wield power because I care enough about running for office that I'm willing to do it if that's what I have to do, tended to, there's an overlap between interest in wielding power and men, and they were more willing to imitate the behavior. The one that surprised me from that research, and is something I think we need to try to figure out how to build on, there was one demographic group that said they would be more willing to run for office after watching the rude clips, not because they wanted to wield power, but because they desperately thought it needed to be fixed, was African American women. Wow. So African American college students had a spike, the only demographic group that had a spike in willingness to run for office after watching rude political interactions. And when you drill down and ask why, they say, because if I don't fix it, who will? Right? So it's like the Fannie Lou Hamer effect or the Stacey Abrams effect. Yeah, it's what I'm going to call it when I write up. So that's next on my list to write that up and send those findings out. But I also think it's like, well, how do we cultivate that? Like, I can certainly, when I'm looking for young women on college campuses to work with, I can certainly go to the African American sororities, or I can try to recruit people who I think will be having that reaction into my classes or into workshops that I might run. But how do we get other women, right, to see that they could potentially be the ones to step up and fix it, like take the hit and fix it?
It's scary though, because those women are the most vulnerable, and right. We're talking about civility, but we're also talking about a climate of political violence.
Yeah, I think that the feel like there's no one standing behind them, right? Mm-hmm. If we continue down a path of rudeness, we continue down a path of incivility, if we become an illiberal democracy where people's rights, like civil rights, are violated, African American women look behind them and there is no one else behind them to hold the line, which is some of where that sentiment comes from. And I'm thinking about when I did that research, we hadn't escalated to as many threats of violence that we're seeing. And so I'm thinking about replicating that research with threats of violence and seeing what the findings are, what people will say. But then I think you have to train people, right? Like, so if you're going to have people step up and run for office when there's rudeness or when there's threats of violence, like you don't just send, any of my students, white men, black men, white women, Asian women, whoever, you don't just send them off, right? That you have workshops and you have trainings and you have people carefully thinking about what they might face and how they're going to prepare themselves to respond to it. So that's where my research with young people, and particularly women, young people, and trying to encourage them to run for, or even serve as poll workers, right? If you don't want to run for office, like step up and do other things, is how do we recruit them into that work, but also how do we better prepare them for it based on what they're going to face right now?
Well, Dr. Strachan, that is fascinating and so much related to the discussion we've been having on Facebook. If you pop over to our Facebook page today about Lady Bird Johnson and the post-civil rights law passage campaign and her attempt to have a very civil campaign in the South. So I encourage everybody to head over to the National First Ladies Library Facebook page and check out the discussion. But I'll be fascinated to see how your research goes. And it sounds like even though things are a little uncivil, that there's a lot of hope hope in female candidates. So I want to thank you so much for joining us during this busy election day. And what better time to have a discussion about Geraldine Ferraro. So if you haven't gotten a chance to see the documentary today, please head over to Canopy and pull it up. If you need a link, please reach out to me. And Dr. Strachan, thank you so much for joining us. And thanks to everyone. It's been a very civil and spirited discussion in the chat. It's been really fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you and have a great day. And please get out there and vote today.